Hello and welcome back to another solo adventure by Simple Time Studios. Remember, if you like this content and would like to see more, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to appease the algorithm gods. We once again return to Robert Manus's Grimmerspace adventures. The setting truths that define our adventure this time. Once again, we will be in the Grimmerspace setting, a sci-fi horror setting created by Iron GM Games. Specifically, our adventure will take us to the planet of Gylorr, one of the two capitals of the Thriftic Binary, and it's a junkyard planet. Junkyards run the length of the planet's surface, and shipbreaker yards in low orbit above the planet provide a steady stream of spare parts and raw materials for planet-side industries. Once again, this is going to be we're going to be converting official creatures over to the Everyday Heroes rules. It's going to be a rather simple find the person story. Robert follows up on a lead he acquires at the start of this session and goes to find a crew member of the expedition that brought him here to this galaxy in the first place. The rules and rubrics that help define our setting are our primary rule set will be the Everyday Heroes RPG with supplementary material from the Vault Volume 1. We will be using the Solo Game Master's Guide by Geek Gamers for oracles and other supplementary rules. Robert is now level 3 Tough Commando, thanks to his previous adventure. We'll see if that's enough. And at the time of writing, the Intergalactic Heroes beta rules have become available and will be added in when applicable. And now we begin our adventure. Robert Manus in Junkyard Rumble. His mission complete, Robert Manus gave his report to Lieutenant Detective Abraham Shields. The after-action report went about as well as Robert expected it to go. The ARC cop listening to Manus talk about his adventures down in the abandoned sublevels in the Endless Mall and rescuing Elroy the Gylorrian. His eyes narrowing before he finally put his face into his hands when the other man got to the end of the story. So there is a massive nest of rogue initials directly below the level we found you on, easily 100? Abraham asked. Yes, sir, Robert replied out of habit. And the only thing keeping them from spilling into the lowest active level in this sector is a door you broke shut? Shields asked again. Yes, sir, Robert repeated. Despite having experienced it firsthand, he had to admit that if his story was any more absurd, it would have been the plot of a cartoon. Looks like Mr. Rim is a regular credit to the Endless Mall management. He certainly is a proud advocate of their ignore the problem until you can't style of leadership. Mulder, Shields' piece, chirped sarcastically from his resting place on the inside of the ARC cop's magnetic duster. Robert did his best to keep his expression neutral as Mulder joined the conversation. Ever since he learned the general details about how an ARC cop's signature piece was made, something Mulder was more than happy to tell him, Robert had always been slightly disturbed by Mulder. And about a lot of things in the Gliding Rim galaxy. The whole take a pencil-shaped sliver of a fallen ARC cop's brain and stick it into a cybernetic hand cannon before issuing it to the next generation of ARC cop thing was something that just made his skin crawl. And of course, it appeared that every other occupational class that was distinctly Grimmerspace involved some sort of freakish body horror. There was something about surviving monsters by becoming one yourself here, some metaphor that seemed to escape him. Yeah, you said it, Mulder. Abraham shook his head and brought Robert out of his thoughts. Okay, putting aside something that is definitely going to become someone's problem later, there's been a couple of updates on the search for your ship, the Cerberus, and your crewmates, the ARC cop continued. A touchdown salvage wrecker brought in your ship. I pulled some rank to get aboard and get the black box. Would have gotten the ship, but unfortunately they didn't believe me when I said I had a line on a surviving crew member, so they sold it to a planet-side junkyard. We translated the contents of the black box, though. Manus kept his expression as neutral as he could. I guess there's no dodging the question anymore, right? Abraham shook his head, and soon the two men began to talk. Robert told the story of who the others were, where they all came from, and how they arrived into the Gliding Rim galaxy. He told the Ark cop about the humans of the Sol Federation and the many martial orders and traditions that kept them safe. He spoke of the humanoids of the Orion Commonwealth who built a utopia based on science, learning, and engineering. He told Shields about how the members of his crew all tried to escape, but the Sunder Mages used their magic to teleport all 4 escape pods to different parts of the galaxy. He looked over and reviewed the EDH format personnel files and filled in some of the details that the files didn't provide. Then Robert looked back at the hardened Grimmer with a pair of cold blue eyes. "Did you find any of them yet?" he asked. "And that comes to the favor the truth seekers want to ask of you. We have 2 unknown individuals that sound suspiciously like your crewmates. There's a fighter pilot running from the Corsarium with a stolen fighter that my contacts in the Vatican Navy are keeping an eye out for. And there's a strange person on Gylorr that I wouldn't even know how to describe if you hadn't told me about the wonder tech you were hiding. Someone apparently crash-landed in the middle of a Vazarian-owned ship scrapyard, and in the middle of the night managed to strip the crash site and everything in a 30-foot radius completely bare before disappearing in a slapdash motorized car of some kind. The Vazarian Corporation that owned that scrapyard is very upset." Robert looked at Shields and turned his head towards the office window and looked through the one-way smart glass. Detective Shields' current office overlooked a large store-lined boulevard in the endless mall. Directly across from the office were 3 boutique shops selling consumer electronics, robotic plushies, and smart fabric designer clothes. Robert then looked back at Shields. "Yeah, what happened was theft, but I think you already know what I would say to that Vazarian Corpo suit, too. Anyway, let me guess. Security footage and eyewitness descriptions describe the perp as a tall, widely built, Urson-like creature with black and white fur, a gunmetal gray engineering bodysuit with cavernous hip pouches, and weird metallic gauntlets that emit energy bubbles." "Got it in one," Shields chuckled. "I figured there was a reason you would tell me about a random corporation complaining about someone stealing scrap metal. And yeah, that sounds like Blossom. The truth seekers aren't the only group looking for her, aren't they?" Robert asked with a suspicious look at the Ark cop. "No, at least 2 Vazarian corporations are looking for her. And as you'd expect, given how secretive you've been about your galaxy's technology, they're very interested in recovering her engineering equipment," Shields replied. "Of course they are. As if the Vazarians don't have enough advantages over their Gylorrian allies or the other 4 polities," Robert replied sarcastically before returning back to the unspoken question. "So do you want me to find her or help you find her? And yes, there is a difference." "We want you to find her and either bring her back to work for us or at least try to do a better job keeping quiet. While I agree the Vazarians need to be taken down a peg, and honestly I think this is the most hilarious case I've ever been on, we do need to stop this before someone gets hurt." Shields nodded in agreement. "Yeah, that sounds about right. All right, where do you want me to start looking besides Gylorr in general? A whole planet's a pretty big place for a manhunt," Robert asked, focusing back to the task at hand. The desk came to life and a holographic map of Gylorr appeared between the 2 men before zooming in on a certain point near the main port city on the planet's equator. The junkyard where this all occurred is on the outskirts of the port city. The vehicle was last seen headed northward, Abraham explained as notes and arrows began to appear atop of the holographic map. Robert looked at the map in contemplation. If this really was Blossom, where would she go? "Say, you said some hucksters sold our ship to a planet-side junkyard. Where is that scrapyard relative to all of this?" Robert asked. Shields looked back at Robert, then entered the data into what they already knew. The resting place of the Cerberus was in the same direction Blossom was last seen in. "You have the ability to track your ship even in all this?" the Adian asked. "Within a certain distance, yes. From here I can't track it, but once I'm on Gylorr I should be able to home in on it. 2 other questions. What do I have to do to challenge Touchdown's claim on my ship, and failing that? How much would it cost me to buy our ship back from those thieving jackals?" Manus replied. Actually, you would have to challenge the company that bought the ship from Touchdown. Then they would have to they would challenge Touchdown's right to sell your ship to them and get their money back. And that's the problem either way. Touchdown sold your ship to a large Fazarian shipbreaking corporation, Starbright Heavy Industries, the hardened space cop answered. Robert exhaled. They don't have offices on Gylorr, do they? He asked, already knowing the answer he was probably going to get. Well, no. They don't have any representatives you can talk to on Gylorr. Virtually all of their workforce on the planet is robotic. You need to go to Fazar if you want to plead your case, and of course, there's the chance that they'll start cutting up your property while you're in transit. Assuming they haven't already, the ARC cop answered glumly. Robert turned this information over in his head and knew what he might have to do. Shields knew what the tough Federation mercenary was thinking and decided to not ask. Finally breaking the silence, the armored soldier nodded. All right, I'll go down and try to track Blossom. I'll start where we think she's heading, and if she's not there, I'll backtrack along her route to see where she ended up. Abraham nodded. I'll see about getting you some transport to Gylorr. For what it's worth, I do hope you find them all. The gliding room is a bad place without someone who has your back. Robert nodded and left the office to collect his gear. Within an hour, his equipment was packed, and he was on a shuttle from the Endless Mall on Gylorr's moon down to the planet itself. The Federation soldier used to wonder why the shuttles on this route were almost always empty and ran such a weird schedule, but after dealing with the Fazarians, he started to recognize the quiet classism for what it was. Elroy, cleaned up and staring blankly at the credit chit he had been given in exchange for keeping quiet, was the only other passenger on this flight down. Nothing else to do, and all his gear crated up, Robert turned to Elroy in the opposite aisle. So how'd you get talked into going up there anyway? They said the toy store hadn't been touched since it was abandoned. I wanted to see what I could find, Elroy replied with a sigh. You risked your neck for some vintage action figures? Robert asked with a raised eyebrow. Yes and no. When I'm not helping my dad in his shop, I fix up old toys for Gylorr's children. If I score any collectibles in good condition, yeah, I sell them. I was mostly looking for broken ones I could scrap for parts. Fazarian robotic plushies are particularly hard to find parts for, and everyone loves them, Elroy explained. Robert silently smiled. Not a bad kid. The four scattered crewmen of the Cerberus could do with a few more friends like Elroy and Detective Shields. Hopefully the others were doing just as well as at acquiring friends, if not better. Still, there was one other question that Manus probably should get answered while he had some downtime. So, who were those urban exploration streamers that left you behind for a laugh? He asked at last. Elroy laughed and pulled out his personal communicator and started playing a video he pulled off of some social media app Robert didn't recognize. The Federation commando expected a lot of things, but he did not expect a Fazarian to have such a strong surfer bro persona. Yo, what's up, my dudes? Now I know some of you are still crusty about leaving that one Gylorrian behind in the Toy Store episode, but don't worry, we're going back down to look for him. We heard he's been spotted in another location in the Endless Mall, and we're heading down there right now. The Fazarian Urban streamer greeted as he fixed his hat. Dressed in a black bodysuit studded with pockets and fire engine red hair peeking out from under a beanie cap, Robert had to admit the streamer at least looked the part of someone that explored abandoned urban spaces for a living. Elroy shook his head and pointed at a sign behind the streamer, smiling as he was barely able to contain his laughter. That's a hotel by the indoor sea. He's looking for me about 1,000 miles away from where you found me. He just posted this video this morning. Wow. Robert put his face in his hand and shook his head. Next thing he knew, he spent the entire shuttle ride down watching urban exploration videos hosted by Get the Glamorous Awesome Abandoned Adventures. Not the best way to spend the ride, but one that definitely familiarized him with one of the gliding rim's most obnoxious streamers. Stepping onto the planet's surface and collecting his gear, the hired gun parted ways with Elroy and went to the business of securing transportation. Blossom's route covered around 50 miles. It was impossible to cover that much distance on foot. The equatorial desert sun beat down on him as he navigated the canvas-covered market stalls and gutted vehicles of the market district as he searched for a vehicle, careful to not mention anything about Blossom's exploits when asked why he was interested in renting a vehicle for a northward drive. An hour later, he rented a quad-cycle ATV and was driving out of the city limits. His pocket computer was nestled in a cup holder between the handlebars and keyed to point towards the Cerberus. The wind whipped in his face as he rode along a worn trail that weaved between the towering hulks of decaying starships and the organized scrap piles of privately owned junkyards. This is going to be a hex exploration section. Robert has to make it through 5 10-mile hexes before he arrives at the junkyard where the Cerberus is buried. Every time he enters a new hex, I will roll to see what he encounters. As Ron and Lou always describe Gylorr as a fairly harsh planet with lots of barren wasteland, I'm starting with the Badlands terrain in the hex around the capital city. 12 on the percentile die and a 2 on the D6 means the next hex is more Badlands with nothing particularly interesting of note outside of a hamlet-sized settlement and no encounters. The barren, trash-covered wasteland continued as Robert drove on, the city starting to shrink into the horizon behind him. A roving caravan of scrappers, a motorized convoy easily 100 people strong, drove past him on their way into the city. Children waved from vehicle windows as he headed past in the other direction. The dirt road he had been following was rutted deep by dozens of vehicles over the dry months, but his pocket computer was still pointed that he was going in the right way to his ship. .36 on terrain, so the next hex is hills. 319 on settlement and ruins means no settlement. 4 on the D6 means no random wilderness flavor either. And 42 on random encounters is above 20, so he doesn't encounter anything either. The terrain soon grew very hilly and rocky. Desert stone broke through the wasteland soil between barren dirt and towering piles of junk. The road became bumpier. More than once, Robert's ATV jumped off the ground as he continued to speed along. A small plume of dust shot up behind his vehicle as he landed and got back on the dusty road. 36 on terrain, so next hex is more hills. 739 means no settlement. 1 on the random wilderness flavor. 46 on what kind, and it's too early to roll for another random encounter. The rough terrain continued with the Federation Commando seeing nothing of note except a giant metal pipe 30 feet above the roadway. It looked like it was for fluid of some kind, but as he drove under it, he couldn't see any other segments. Was there an attempt to irrigate the wasteland at some point? It was a question that would have to wait for another time. He needed to keep going and see if he was still in time to head off a potential disaster. 33 on terrain, still more hills. 457 means no settlement. 5 on the wilderness flavor means there isn't anything of note here. Hills of dry, sun-baked earth continued to compete with hills of scrap and wrecked starships. Robert thought he saw work crews breaking down junk, but it turned out to be a trick of the sun. On one hand, he was impressed by how well organized Gylorr's scrap industry was. Upon the other, it still struck him as inefficient and a horribly stupid industry to be stratified between haves and have-nots. If Gylorr was a world in the Sol Federation, to say nothing of the Orion Commonwealth, most of these scrap fields would be picked completely cleaned and terraformed into lush grasslands. And there would be none of this 90% is our share nonsense that the Fazarians apparently pulled on Gylorr. It was junk, scrap metal and garbage that hadn't been broken back down into feedstock yet. It wasn't some rare mineral or complex chemical compound where there needed to be a tally of who earned what. While the crew of the Cerberus were explorers, not diplomats, Robert had a hard time imagining the Sol Federation getting along particularly well with the Thriftic Binary if this was how its member worlds treated each other. He knew the Orion Commonwealth was not going to stand for the blatantly lopsided economy of the Binary and likely would need to be held back to keep from flooding Gylorr's planetary data networks with plans for rudimentary universal constructors. No matter, that was a problem for the future. Right now his pocket computer told him he was at the junkyard where the Cerberus rested. Here he was where he would hopefully find Blossom and start reuniting the ship's crew. The Starbright scrapyard was a massive compound marked by a menacing chain link fence that seemed to be made entirely out of barbed wire and hummed with the faint sound of electricity. Towering piles of scrap were neatly stacked behind the fence. Robert drove around the compound the best he could without looking too suspicious. There had to be security of some kind, he thought as he looked at the fence, trying to identify where would be a good place to hide cameras or other passive security devices. Are there any cameras or motion-sensitive alarms that Robert can see? I give it around a 50-50 based on his skills and whether or not Starbright went cheap. 50 on the dot says yes. Since it's so close, I'm going to interpret that as there are, but there aren't many, and they have some serious blind spots. There was perimeter security studying the fence at key points, but it wasn't remotely subtle, and if he was understanding what he was looking at, not only were there multiple arcs with no camera coverage, but the ones that were present were set up too high and angled too far straight to see what was directly below them. He could be arranging the rocks to say all manner of rude things about the company and they wouldn't see it. Finding the cobbled-together scrapper's jalopy that Blossom supposedly built parked at a breach in the fence, Robert parked, then dismounted, and promptly got his weapons ready as he took in his surroundings and saw a number of things he didn't like. Their parking spot was not near the main entrance like he originally worried, showing that Blossom was demonstrating far more subtlety than he originally gave her credit for. Unfortunately, there was a huge, jagged hole in the fence. While the Orion Panda was a very tall and stout girl, the hole in the fence was easily twice her size, and Blossom was precise almost to a fault. She would have never been happy with cutting a hole that jagged in case it accidentally cut someone. Robert made sure there was a fresh power cell in his rifle before he checked Blossom's car. No gear, no Blossom, no sign of a fight. With his pocket computer tucked in a bandolier pocket over his armor, he took in a deep breath and walked through the ruined fence. Robert is going to attempt a survival check to remain concealed and track any potential predators. He rolls a 9 on a 1d20 plus 2. Well, he isn't concealed, but he is actively listening for any trouble. Too organized, too much open ground, and not enough space he was certain he could fit in and hide in successfully. But he could hear the cries of the creatures that dwelled here. There was the cries of wild bracts, the giant iguana-like creatures that the Gylorrians kept as dogs. And then there was the chittering of insect mandibles that he recognized as the Iglesias. And then there was also the faint mechanical whine of something else, probably the automated Starbright robots going about their pre-programmed routines. It was beautiful in a grim way, the daily routines of the junkyard inhabitants going on oblivious to him. Hopefully it would stay that way. Robert wasn't sure how long he would last if things turned hostile. Yet no sooner did he think this than he heard the distinct report of an energy rifle discharging and a Barack's howling in pain. On reflex, he dropped into a crouch and raised his rifle up to his shoulder, trying to make himself as small of a target as possible while still caught out in the open. Ahead of him, that initial shot turned into a chaotic racket as a pack of Bracks ran into view to escape that insectoid chittering. The Ignatius! Thankfully, both of them were a good 200 feet or so away from him, so as long as the Bracks didn't turn towards him, Okay, Oracle, do the barracks turn towards him? I give it a 50-50, so 14 is definitely a yes. They turned towards him, but as soon as the pack leader began to turn in his direction and lead the rest of the barracks right to him, Robert turned and tried to find a place to hide in the nearest junk pile. Robert makes a stealth check to try and hide in the junk stack. 1d20 plus 4, and we have a 16. I'm going to say he's hidden so long as he doesn't directly engage either party. Hiding inside a gutted escape pod and quietly shutting the door behind him, Robert watched out a broken window as both groups ran past right by him without looking twice towards his hiding spot. Waiting several minutes after he heard the last "Gracias" skitter away, he carefully opened the door and continued on his way. The barracks were part of the planet's native ecosystem, but what were the Gracias doing here? Were they deliberately placed by the company that owned the scrapyard? Were they a part of a Fazarian military ship that wasn't cleaned properly before getting scrapped here, and did they get loose? It was a question that would have to wait. Robert checked his pocket computer again and started walking towards the location of the Cerberus. The sooner he got there and hopefully found Blossom, the sooner he could figure out their next move. The sun continued to drift from midday to late afternoon as he made his way through the junkyard. After one last turn in a particularly narrow passage, he arrived in the middle of a small clearing. As a recent arrival, the Cerberus hadn't been covered by junk yet. There was nothing obstructing the airlocks. Pulling out his pocket computer, he pinged the ship's computer and was relieved to get a response. At least that system worked. Hull looked pretty intact, too. Maybe the damage wasn't as bad as Abraham thought it was. Maybe they could still fix it. Boarding the ship, weapons still raised, he checked the ship from the bridge down. Keeping his ears open, he listened for the sound of Blossom working. Is Blossom all right and working on repairing the ship? I give it a 50-50 chance, and 60%, oh no. By the time he arrived down in the ship's medical bay, he found Blossom lying on one of the medical beds and groaning softly. Almost immediately he lowered his weapon and rushed over to her side. Blossom! Blossom! 5 more minutes, please. The stout Orion panda moaned and wheezed as she looked up at him with a glazed look in her eyes. Robert looked her over and noticed a spot on her upper arm where the sleeve had been punctured, and there was dark black scabbing surrounding what looked like a giant bite mark. Blossom, what happened? Are you all right? Can you fix the ship? He asked urgently. She was clearly delirious, but they needed to hurry. Blossom replied with a raspy laugh. There was a bug, a big bug. It bit me, but I managed to lock it in engineering. I'm fine. The autodoc says I need 5 more minutes for the antibiotics to take effect. She replied with a weak smile like she was thinking, silly human. Robert looked up. Sure enough, the autodoc was right where it was supposed to be and showed that it was still drawing power from the ship's reactor. What did the pirates and salvagers take, then? Robert could have sworn up and down that medical equipment would be one of the first things to get pilfered in this galaxy. He looked back at Blossom, suddenly aware of some indignant chittering from deeper in the ship. Can you fix it? He asked again, this time with more urgency. All right. I give it a somewhat likely chance that they might have a happy ending here. And 11 under 60, according to the Oracle. Yeah, she's got this. She nodded weakly. Sure, I can fix this. I just need 5 more minutes. She smiled and dozed back off. Smiling, because things were finally looking up, Robert left the medical bay and shut the door behind him. Thinking twice, he pulled out his pocket computer one more time and activated the remote lock twice. Once to lock the medical bay door, the other to unlock and open the door to engineering. It was a straight shot down to engineering from where he stood, and there was plenty of corridor between him and what sounded suspiciously like an Iglesias. All right, you overgrown cockroach, come and get me, he shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the ship, before he dropped into a kneeling position facing the door with his weapon raised. For a moment he didn't think it would take the obvious bait, but a second later, that familiar chitinous body stepped into the doorway. Alright, we'll start with Robert's ready to attack. He beats the intruder's defense of 12 with a 22, but he only does 3 points of damage. The bug has 31 HP left. His opening shot sent a single laser blast down the corridor and hitting the creature squarely in the chest. Unfortunately, it looks like he barely singed a chunk of the creature's armor off. Okay, now for initiative. Robert gets a 16 on a 1d20 plus 2. Ignatius gets a 1. While it didn't do the damage he wanted, the shock of taking a laser blast to the chest mentally stunned the Ignatius long enough for Robert to fire off a quick burst to press his advantage. Gets a 9 on the attack roll of 1d20 plus 2. Unfortunately, he completely missed his second attack and sprayed the bulkhead door with laser fire. He doubled back down the hall into the ship's common room. Behind him, the insect shock trooper recovered its wits and gave chase, firing after Robert with its own laser rifle. 18 on a 1d20 plus 6, that narrowly hits. Robert takes 13 damage thanks to his damage resistance of 2 from being a tough hero. He has 22 HP left. The Ignatius took aim and hit Robert in the shoulder with a laser bolt. His armor dissipated most of the heat, but there was an uncomfortable warmth in his left shoulder that he knew was going to become a nasty blister later. Gritting his teeth, he turned and fired another burst. $16 on a 1d20 plus 2 for a burst fire. 11 on a 1d12 plus 2. 10 on the second 1d12 plus 2 for a total of 21 damage. The Ignatius has 10 HP left. And at the time, I totally forgot about the Tough Hero's payback ability. But oh well, it would have been the difference between a 16 and an 18. The second time on a semi-automatic burst went much better than the first. Robert aimed for the center of mass and landed multiple shots into the Ignatius torso, causing light green, yellow-green ichor to blossom in steaming jets as laser blasts pierced its chest multiple times. Assaulted by a foe it couldn't beat in single combat, the Ignatius' survival instincts kicked in and it started to retreat back to engineering post-haste. Robert knew there was an airlock down there it was likely going to escape through, but he was not having it. Running after it, he switched to single-shot mode and fired again. 1d10 on 10 on a 1d20 plus 4. I'm going to just use extra effort and fire again. 11 on a 1d20 plus 4. It's less than 12, but I'm just going to say the previous attack is carapace enough and give it to him since he does enough damage to finish it anyway with 13. The first shot missed, the beam just scraping the top of the chitin over something that didn't look vital. Hyped on adrenaline, determined not to have a repeat of the last time he fought with the Ignatius, Robert quickly fired again and scored one last hit, sending the beam right through the bug's head and vaporizing a chunk of it off. As it fell over dead, he lowered his rifle and leaned against the metal hull. His adrenaline was fading fast, but it was dead. It was dead, and they could work on their next move. Almost on cue, the door to the medical bay opened, and Blossom stepped out, looking much better than she did roughly 5 minutes ago. She took one look at Robert, then at the insect corpse in the doorway leading to the engine room. Took care of the bug that was keeping you from working. Manus looked up at her with a laugh. Blossom squealed and scooped up the smaller sapient in a big hug. Robert had worked with the Orions long enough to just go with it. Besides, it's not like they both didn't need a hug just getting this far in the gliding rim galaxy. End of story.